So, recording for the second half is on. Obviously, I wasn't with you for the previous discussions, and I haven't seen the videos or anything. So, but today we're concluding a room of one's own, right?
Right.
And let's conduct this somewhat differently than the way we did the Republic discussion, both for a variety of reasons, and have it more amongst you and less me directing things. I've worked with this book before. I know got a lot of things to say, et cetera, but since I wasn't privy to your earlier conversation and how Claudia started you out, I don't want to hijack the thing in the middle. So why don't you guys start playing? What are some of the things you were discussing last time with the first part of Room of One's Own? What did you see in today's reading of Room of One's Own? Ultimately, again, by the time we're done with the hour and a half today, that, you know, to try to get a sense of what is it that Virginia Woolf has wrought in this particular work. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet for about the next 5 minutes, and you guys have at it, and then I'll have something to say.
Well, I'll jump in, I guess. I was struck in this part of the book that there's very much a sense of class that's being kicked around, and it raised in my mind the whole question of art and commerce and the interaction between the two. So I'm looking at page 65, where she writes about, 12 lines down, money dignifies what is frivolous if unpaid for. And after she was talking about these great women, sort of the upper class women with time and leisure to write, the Bronte sisters and others, this notion, and of course it gets back to the title of the work, A Room of Their Own, what woman needs to have an income and a place to write. But I just am questioning that very line. Is I think of Emily Dickinson, who wrote for her own delight. In fact, she has a line about a page earlier, Virginia Woolf does, where she talks about the bottom of 63, we leave behind, shut up in their parks among their folios, those solitary great ladies who wrote without audience or criticism for their own delight alone, which to me is Emily Dickinson, and plenty of others too. And I just thought that was a very provocative statement that got to class consciousness, that wealthy and independently wealthy, supported women could do that even if no one read them, but that there might be these great lights and great talents of modest means who never would have that chance to be an artist.
And elsewhere in the book, I don't quite remember where, but she makes a point that of all the, I think, the male poets, 7 out of 10 were university students, and only one, I think it was Keats maybe, that didn't have any formal education, something like that. So she was trying to make the point that you're not born a poet, that you have to study your craft and be educated at school to be able to do it well.
I like the way it ended, kind of inspirational to people who write, especially women, because she said that the sister, I don't know, fictional or not fictional, of Shakespeare, that never wrote, so we the women have to write for her because she lives in each one of us. So it seems like inspirational.
Ned, going on what you were saying about if money is put forth, it makes the writing less frivolous or something to that effect. There was another section that starts on the bottom of page 51, the last paragraph, and it's kind of a humbling paragraph in that Virginia Woolf says or the narrator says that the writers put forth an enormous amount of effort, but that there's a lot of indifference, and the vast majority of the general population really doesn't care whether poems are written or fiction's written. And then they say that if they have this indifference and don't care whether it's written or not, it really takes they won't pay for what they don't want. So something's got to be really, really good for people to put out money for it. I thought it was kind of humbling. You could you could be toiling away, and then put forth a work and nobody buys it because they're all indifferent to it. Whereas the person of money, it's probably a source of pride, but they don't care nearly as much whether their work is purchased or not, because they don't need it to make a living. And then later, in one of the other chapters, she makes a point of I can't think of the person's name. I think her name was Aftha or Arfa or something like that. But she's Virginia Woolf cites her as one of the turning points because she was a woman of middle class and had to make her living writing, and that's one of the several turning points in women becoming writers.
But it isn't just a question of whether they produce a marketable product, is it? I mean, it's partly their gender-related restrictions, the child rearing responsibilities, and then the fact that in certain circumstances they couldn't even have property. Whatever they made belonged to their husband. So until the 19th or 18th century, there was no possibility of income. And just basically on Dickinson, I thought her brother supported her. And she basically was a woman of leisure.
What I found most striking, and I'm not sure I wasn't part of the discussion last week, was there's the income piece to it, but what really struck me is her argument around the way women were cut off from experience. When you talk about what men had to do or saw as the responsibility of as part of the patriarchy, and the experience whether that was going off to war, going off to school, having to earn a living, that provides very rich fodder for a writer, regardless of talent. But thinking through the hermetically sealed world of a woman of any class, and the paucity of experience by comparison, struck me again, was one of those, like a clarion cry in terms of relative to what women write about and the constraints that a woman writer, even in the mid 19th century, would still have.
And along with the lack of experience, the fact that education wasn't available for a lot of women. It's hard to write poetry if you don't have some education.
No, and not only that, but they were marginalized and looked down upon in terms of the possibility of having any literary talent.
Anybody else?
About marginalizing the woman, George Eliot was not a true author. The lady's name was something else, but in order to sell her books, she put a man's name to be able to sell the books, to make money.
Okay, so last time you guys did books chapters 1 to 3, right?
Yes.
And was there some headline or headlines to either what you discussed or what Claudia had, anything just that I should be aware of before we kind of go through this? Something key headlines from books chapters 1 to 3? No, it's almost like our class didn't take place. Okay, so let me say a couple of things and then see if we can look at some passages here. And I think I must have a different edition than you, so my page numbers are not going to match your page numbers, but hopefully the text itself will match the text itself. So without any kind of implied commentary about Claudia, if it's me doing this, I can only do it my way. And my way, as you know, is this idea that the goal here is to try to understand every book we read from the author's perspective to the extent that we can. And so we've got a book here called The Room of One's Own. It's got a little epigraph at the beginning, which I don't know if you discussed about, that this essay is based upon 2 papers from October 1928. The papers were too long to be read in full and have since been altered and expanded. And then starts out with chapter 1 and goes through chapter 6, as you know, and then that constitutes the book, you know, A Room of One's Own. And so what I'd like to see if we can do is to talk about, in some sense, what happens in chapter 1, what happens in chapter 2, what happens in chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6, and how this builds up to make a book. And I mean, this can sound kind of pedantic and silly, but I think it's really the way we go about these things. And did you, somebody mentioned something about the narrator. Did you discuss like who the narrating voice was last time? No?
No.
Nothing. Okay. So let's go back to the very beginning. And what I'd like to suggest, and you know, like I said, it's still me. I can't pretend I'm not me. These chapters are not titled. But I would encourage you, when you come across a book where the chapters are not titled, or even if they are actually, that you should try to make your own titles for them. What is the subject matter of chapter 1? What is the subject matter of chapter 2? And we're going to do this together. And how does it fit together to make the work? And so if we go to the very beginning, and I'm sorry, you know, like I said, the page numbers won't match, but it's chapter 1, the first paragraph, whatever page number that is for you. And Virginia Woolf starts out this way. But you may say, we asked you to speak about women in fiction. What has that got to do with a room of one's own? I will try to explain. But when you asked me to speak about women in fiction, I sat down on the banks of a river and began to wonder what the words meant. They might mean simply a few remarks about Fanny Burney, a few more about Jane Austen, a tribute to the Brontes, and a sketch of Haworth Parsonage under snow. Some witticisms, if possible, about Miss Mitford, a respectful allusion to George Eliot, a reference to Mrs. Gaskell, and one would have done. But at second sight, the words seemed not so simple. The title Women in Fiction might mean, and you might have meant it to mean, women and what they are like. Or it might mean women and the fiction that they write. Or it might mean women and the fiction that is written about them. Or it might mean that somehow all three are inextricably mixed together and you want me to consider them in that light. But when I began to consider the subject in this last way, which seemed the most interesting, I soon saw that it had one fatal drawback. I should never be able to come to a conclusion. I should never be able to fulfill what is, I understand, the first duty of a lecturer. To hand you, after an hour's discourse, a nugget of pure truth to wrap up between the pages of your notebooks and keep on the mantelpiece forever. All I could do was to offer you an opinion upon one minor point. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. And that, as you will see, leaves the great problem of the true nature of woman and the true nature of fiction unsolved. I have shirked the duty of coming to a conclusion upon these two questions. Women and fiction remain, so far as I am concerned, unsolved problems. But in order to make some amends, I am going to do what I can to show you how I arrived at this opinion about the room and the money. I'm going to develop in your presence, as fully and freely as I can, the train of thought which led me to think this. Perhaps if I laid bare the ideas, the prejudices that lie behind this statement, you will find that they have some bearing upon women and some upon fiction. At any rate, when a subject is highly controversial, and any question about sex is that, one cannot hope to tell the truth. One can only show how one came to hold whatever opinion one does hold. One can only give one's audience the chance of drawing their own conclusions as they observe the limitations, the prejudices, the idiosyncrasies of the speaker. Fiction here is likely to contain more truth than fact. Therefore, I propose making use of all the liberties and licenses of a novelist to tell you the story of the 2 days that preceded my coming here, how, bowed down by the weight of the subject which you have laid upon my shoulders, I pondered it and made it work in and out of my daily life. I need not say that what I am about to describe has no existence. Oxbridge is an invention. So is Fernham. I is only a convenient term for somebody who has no real being. Lies will flow from my lips, but there may perhaps be some truth mixed up with them. It is for you to seek out this truth and to decide whether any part of it is worth keeping. If not, you will of course throw the whole of it into the waste paper basket and forget all about it. Here then was I. Call me Mary Beaton, Mary Seaton, Mary Carmichael, or by any other name you please. It is not a matter of any importance. ... Now, obviously we've only got a certain amount of time today, so we're going to have to be a little brisk about certain things, but I think it's really worth considering what's just happened in the first page and a half, or however many pages it is in your book. What's the setting, just like we did with Socrates and the framing of the Republic, what's the framing device around this book? And what does it mean to say fiction here is likely to contain more truth than fact? And therefore, I propose to use the liberties and licenses of a novelist to tell you a story. Call me Mary Beaton, Mary Seaton, it don't matter. Here we go. Miss Amy.
Yeah, so actually, Adam, so I'm talking on the phone, even though you kind of see me. So I'm glad that you are with us for this class, because it occurred to me as during the last book of the Republic, when Socrates, just takes it out on poetry and fiction, so to speak, that here we have the other version of it, and that is that Virginia Woolf is putting forth the idea that fiction actually highlights reality to a greater extent so that we can understand it and it becomes more real and more present to us. And so here we have Virginia Woolf, or I'm sorry, the narrator has been asked to give a talk on women in fiction, and she can't really decide what that means, but she does have very specific ideas about what it would take for a woman to be a writer, and that is a certain level of independence, which comes through both money and privacy, for lack of a better description.
Wait, Amy, just let me cut you off. Can you tell who the audience is, who the narrator is speaking to?
I imagined that this was going to be a gathering of women, like some kind of social group that's, maybe this is a leftover from the suffrage movement. You know, there's these women and they have a little bit of leisure because they can obviously get away together and you know, gather to hear a speaker. Maybe there's some men in the audience, I don't know. But the topic is of interest to women, and I believe it's addressed to women.
Wasn't it for women's colleges, 2 women's colleges at either Cambridge or Oxford?
So that's what the epigraph at the beginning tells us. And if you kind of Google it and figure out, I mean, that this is a woman speaking to women undergraduates essentially, and whether as Amy, maybe you're even correct that the original narrating voice is literally Virginia Woolf in some way, speaking to these young students. But anyway, continue. I mean, but just so we're getting as full a picture as we can before we leap off into the story. Amy, did you have other?
So, no, I did get the impression that we started with Virginia Woolf, and maybe she really is addressing an actual audience, but then she makes this leap into this imaginary world, this sequence of events, which could have happened, maybe not, who knows. It doesn't matter, because the point is that by exploring life through fiction, we can arrive at certain truths which do pertain to reality in a heightened sense than our average everyday lives allow us to experience.
And that somehow they can be more, that the fiction can give us access to more truth than fact can.
Yes. Yes. Because fiction can give us truths that are too dense for mere facts, which is completely contrary to what Socrates would tell us. So that's why I like.
Well,
I like
arguably, although I don't want to derail that, but arguably Plato's work is a complete work of fiction.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Other thoughts about this framing of a room of one's own?
Well, one of the things it does is it just plays to Woolf's strengths as a novelist. And it also gives some distance for her and for the narrator. Since it's a work of fiction, then it would be presumed to not be true. Therefore, it gives her more license to say things that might be very politically objectionable, even though the suffrage has passed in the century she's living in, the decade that she's living. So it gives her some, it actually allows the audience, she's giving them actually a comfort zone that they can work in. If they really want to object to it, then they can, by using this kind of device. It's like a cloaking device in a way.
And I think we could say that actually everything after the Mary Beaton, Mary Seton, Virginia Woolf has just disclaimed the truthiness of. I mean, what's actually described in chapter 2 didn't really happen, or we're going to kind of do this here. I want to put the whiteboard on if I can, see if I can do this, and just to see if we can do a little, a simple outline here, if we've got our 6 chapters, and that whether the first chapter is simply raising a bunch of questions, problems. There's some questions about women in fiction. That something, and you know, this again, a lot of this is going to be about British stuff, which may not mean something as much here, but this Oxbridge, this notion of Oxbridge, this kind of conflation of Cambridge and Oxford, questions about women and fiction, that this woman has been tasked to give a lecture on women and fiction. Okay, let's fast forward to chapter 2. We're going to frog march you through Virginia Woolf.
Can I say something, Adam?
Sure.
In chapter 1, she has her main theme, her main statement that she proceeds to prove out through the other chapters, and that is a woman needs a room of her own and some money.
500 pounds a year, right?
Yeah, that's a significant statement right from the beginning.
Because?
That's the name of the book. And
okay, beyond that.
Well, beyond that, well, what she's saying is that essentially there isn't much fiction by women, and the reason for that is they are so busy with, you know, raising kids, and they have no.
Now you're giving us the whole rest of the book. I mean, we're just saying within chapter 1, you're saying Virginia Woolf is giving us the ending point at the beginning, so we know where we're going to end up.
Yes, that's her statement. Yes.
So we shouldn't be surprised at where the book, at the conclusion that's reached. In fact, the whole point of the book is not actually to tell us what the conclusion is. She says
Right.
The whole point of the book is to show us how the conclusion was arrived at.
Right.
And is that significant, Bob?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, to me, it's very significant because she's making the statement right in the beginning, so you know that she's going to prove that statement.
Or at least show how she came to her conclusion.
Right.
And allow the reader to judge for themselves whether
Right.
they agree or disagree. Yes?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. So, chapter 2. Somebody's been asked to give a lecture about women in fiction. What's the next step, Dick?
She goes to the museum and looks in the library for what has been written on the subject.
Like any good lecturer, she starts doing research. And this, you know, this is taking place in London. So this is the British Library, which is housed in the British Museum. And what is the net result of the research that's done, Dick?
She finds that men have written innumerable books about women, and women have written hardly anything about men. And she detects a note of anger in what the men have written about women and tries to understand why they should be angry, and decides that in some cases they feel their superiority is threatened.
Okay. Say any more about that, Nick?
No, I don't have anything additional.
Amy? You keep cutting in and out. I can't tell if you're there. So.
Sorry, I'm here. Yeah, so I think at this point, I might be confusing the chapters, but she seems to make a point that that the men being angry, and then also the women being angry, comes in the way of actually being an incandescent mind and being able to write good literature. And I think she makes the point for both sexes.
Right, we're going to get to that a little bit further on. But in terms of going to
Okay.
the British Library, and does she find the answers she needs for her lecture?
No, not at all. She finds more data points on men misrepresenting women and having at times an agenda against them.
All right, somebody's been asked to give a lecture about women in fiction, has tried to do her research on the subject, goes to the best library in the British Empire, and finds diddly squat on the subject. And yet, apparently, so I don't know what page you have this on, but there's a page by a book by Professor Von X, his monumental work called The Mental, Moral, and Physical Inferiority of the Female Sex. Can somebody tell me what page you guys have that on?
It's on 31.
Oh, okay.
31.
I got it on 31 also.
Okay.
This may be a rare confluence. So we don't have time to go through this whole thing, but the question of when the narrator, Mary Beaton, Mary Seaton, whatever, is reading through this book, it turns out she's doodling on a piece of paper and making a sketch of the professor, which makes her think that maybe he's angry. And there's about a page after where the title of the book is. So on mine, it's on page 32 near the bottom. It begins in this long paragraph, how to explain the anger of the professors. Everybody see that?
No.
After the Hampstead Heath?
Okay, yeah.
What
Okay.
page?
Yeah,
32?
right near the middle.
Everybody see it?
Paragraph.
Yeah.
So the narrator goes on, how to explain the anger of the professors. Why were they angry? For when it came to analyzing the impression left by these books, there was always an element of heat. This heat took many forms. It showed itself in satire, in sentiment, in curiosity, in reprobation. But there was another element which was often present and could not immediately be identified. Anger, I called it, but it was anger that had gone underground and mixed itself with all kinds of other emotions. To judge from its odd effects, it was anger disguised and complex, not anger simple and open. Whatever the reason, all these books, I thought, surveying the pile on the desk, are worthless for my purposes. They were worthless scientifically, that is to say, though humanly they were full of instruction, interest, boredom, and very queer facts about the habits of the Fiji Islanders. They had been written in the red light of emotion and not in the white light of truth. Therefore, they must be returned to the central desk and restored each to his own cell in the enormous honeycomb. All that I retrieved from that morning's work had been the one fact of anger. And she goes on, well, why were they angry? And so a little bit farther down, she says, I strolled off to find a place for luncheon. What is the real nature of what I call for the moment their anger, I asked. Here was a puzzle that would last all the time that it takes to be served with food in a small restaurant somewhere near the British Museum. Some previous luncher had left the lunch edition of the evening paper on a chair, and waiting to be served, I began idly reading the headlines. A ribbon of very large letters ran across the page. Somebody had made a big score in South Africa. Lesser ribbons announced that Sir Austen Chamberlain was at Geneva. A meat axe with human hair on it had been found in a cellar. Mr. Justice so-and-so commented in the divorce courts upon the shamelessness of women. Sprinkled about the paper were other pieces of news. A film actress had been lowered from a peak in California and hung suspended in midair. The weather was going to be foggy. The most transient visitor to this planet, I thought, who picked up this paper could not fail to be aware, even from this scattered testimony, that England is under the rule of a patriarchy. Nobody in their senses could fail to detect the dominance of the professor. His was the power and the money and the influence. And I would love to read all this out, but we don't really have time. But how everything is being determined by men. And about another page farther along, there's a sentence that says, the professors or patriarchs, as it might be more accurate to call them, might be angry for that reason partly, but partly for one that lies a little less obviously on the surface. Possibly they were not angry at all. Often indeed they were admiring, devoted, exemplary in the relations of private life. Possibly when the professor insisted a little too emphatically upon the inferiority of women, he was concerned not with their inferiority, but with his own superiority. That was what he was protecting rather hot-headedly and with too much emphasis, because it was like a jewel to him of the rarest price. Life for both sexes, and I looked at them shouldering their way along the pavement, is arduous, difficult, a perpetual struggle. It calls for gigantic courage and strength. More than anything, perhaps, creatures of illusion as we are, it calls for confidence in oneself. Without self-confidence, we are as babes in the cradle. And how can we generate this imponderable quality, which is yet so invaluable, most quickly? By thinking that other people are inferior to oneself. By feeling that one has some innate superiority. It may be wealth or rank, a straight nose, or the portrait of a grandfather by Romney, for there is no end to the pathetic devices of the imagination, human imagination, over other people. And about another half page on, she says, women have served all these centuries as looking glasses, possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of man at twice its natural size. So I'd like to pause here again and just see if we can talk a little bit about this. Stephen?
I mean, it's a wonderful buildup from the library and its dissatisfactions and pulling a thread in terms of the male titles to reading the paper with all the action being about the men, to then framing it in a sense of, what is it that drives, the male-dominated newspapers to feature things about men, and the notion of the need to, it's not about specifically, well, it shows itself about defining the women as inferior, but again, it's more about this need to assert and reassert the power of the patriarchy and the insecurity that underlies that.
All right, others?
Well, I think one of the things that she's bringing up here that becomes really important. I think it's in the last chapter. She's talking about reality. Who controls reality? Who writes the books? Who writes the headlines? Who leaves the documents behind? They're the people, they're the ones who control not just history, they control the reality, which is one of the reasons she leaves the museum too, is that she realized there weren't facts here. There weren't going to be any facts about women because women were invisible. And I think this is one of the things.
Wait. There's all kinds of books about women in that library.
Yeah, but they're all about women from a perspective, from a point of view that has a particular bias. And that's, you know, the thing that she's pointing out here is that's why a writer is so important, because getting that down on a piece of paper, what the reality is, what you're observing, what you're seeing, that has an impact, not just in the present, and it has the impact on the past and on the future. So I think that's one of the other things here. It's not just about the patriarchy, because then you just get angry about it. What you have to do is understand, what is this really about? And then what it's about is being able to put a certain spin on reality, because reality is what people write, or what people report, or what people film.
Dick?
So
Amy?
I had a different impression than Nancy about her discussion of reality in that last chapter. I really thought she was talking about more the nature of being and less about current events, or less about political structures, or, you know, who the newspaper headlines are about. I really thought it was about the world, because she was talking about not our relation to each other as men and women, but our relation to reality, to being itself, to existence, to that deeper flow of life than just what is at the surface, you know, our surface interactions with each other.
I think that she is, because just even the way that she writes, she's all about that wave, the flow, the momentum in life. But if you turn to 110, we're going ahead. But when she says what is meant by reality, it would seem to be something very erratic and very undependable. If you go down a few lines, she said, but whatever it touches, it fixes and makes permanent. That is what remains over what the skin of the day, when the skin of the day has been cast into the hedge. That is what is left of past time and of our loves and hates. Now the writer, as I think, has the chance to live more than other people in the presence of this reality. It is his business to find it and collect it and communicate it to the rest of us. So it's just about being able to bring that perspective of the flow of life to everyone.
Yeah, but maybe if we can hold off jumping ahead just a little bit in terms of following, I mean, to the extent that this is a story here, and therefore there might actually be a plot to this book. And on the chapter 1, we have this woman who's been asked to give a lecture about women in fiction. And then in chapter 2 is trying to do research about the subject women in fiction, goes to the temple of knowledge, as it were, in the British Empire, and finds diddly squat useful, but comes up with another question, which is, if the men are controlling everything, why are the men also angry? I mean, that seems paradoxical. You would think that the men are on easy street. They would just be cool as cucumbers. And yet, according to the narrator, men are perpetually, the male authors, are perpetually seem to be angry. And I mean, if we're just talking, I know I'm jumping back and forth. Maybe we'll do the same thing as we did with Plato, but in the other direction. Now think a little philosophically.
I thought this fit right in with Miss Republic.
How so?
On page 38, she talks about sort of the devil's bargain the men have made, that they had money and power, but only at the cost of harboring in their breasts an eagle, a vulture, forever tearing the liver out and plucking at the lungs, the instinct for possession, the rage for acquisition, which drives them to desire other people's fields and goods perpetually, to make frontiers and flags, battleships and poison gas, etc., etc., etc. It's the more brings war, straight out of Republic, if you ask me.
But this is also apparently tied into the fact that men apparently feel a need to make women perpetually inferior.
Right.
Or, I mean, that, you know, I mean, to me, women have served all these centuries as looking glasses, possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of man at twice its natural. You know, it's like those funhouse mirrors where you look in, right?
Right.
But I take it that Wolf is saying that this distortion, this prejudice, this inferiorizing of women has some functional value for the men. That it's not accidental, it's not arbitrary. In fact, the same process could be done on the basis of wealth or rank or nose shape or presumably skin color. I mean, there's a million ways we can make other people inferior.
Yep.
But that has some functional value.
To keep the superiority.
Yes, but that it has some functional value. That civilization might depend upon this.
Or at least the patriarchy.
Well, yes, but that men can't go out and do what they need to do if they can't go to breakfast feeling already innately superior with their breakfast mate.
Well, he does talk about the need for confidence. And he says that women boost men's confidence.
And I'm going to ask you just as it, whether that's actually sincere, like whether there's a kind of compassion under that, there's a real sympathy for the predicament that would-be empire builders face. That it's a big, brutal world out there, and you need a little ego.
I don't buy it.
But the question is this what the book is saying or not, Robert?
The book is saying it, and I disagree with her statement that men need to put down women to increase their self-confidence. I think that's one of the statements that Virginia Woolf says in the beginning of the book, that some of what I say are going to be lies. And I think that is a lie. I agree with her later.
Well, I think it's the other way around. I think she claims that the fact that she actually went to the British Library or went to lunch is the lie.
No, even before she goes to the library, I think she says that I'm going to take an author's liberty, and some of what I say is going to be lies.
And the lie is,
and it's up to you to decide whether what I say is the truth or whether it belongs to the waste paper basket. That's just my opinion. I think I buy what she's saying a little bit later on that page when she talks about the looking glass. Like women are compelled to reflect whatever the man is feeling about himself to double it in size. I can appreciate that, but I can't appreciate men are putting down women consciously so that they have more self-confidence. I don't buy that one bit.
well, so there's two separate things. Whether you agree with the conclusion or not is one thing, but the other one is whether the book intends that to be taken as true.
I don't know if she intends that to be taken as truth or if it's a red herring, but that's what she's saying.
And so the question is whether in chapter 2, Mary Beaton, Mary Seaton, Virginia Woolf, whoever it is trying to give the reader some analysis of why there is that the patriarchy is not an accident.
Yeah, I know what she's trying to convince the reader, of her opinions. And but
disagree with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but for the purpose of understanding the book, we're back to the same thing. The question is, what does the Virginia Woolf, the author, want the reader to agree with, and you're free to agree or disagree.
Yeah.
But whether this is the book's point of view. Diane, you got any thoughts about this?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Nancy, anything further?
I think that Woolf believes that this is, if you look through the books as she has, that this is true, and it's what Professor X, I mean, we just read what Professor X said about the inferiority of women. I mean, it wasn't just women, it was inferiority of lots of people who were just simply different.
Okay, but the title of the book
Right.
in the library.
And this is about, yes. I mean, I guess I believe that she believes that, and I believe that it was so. It was so then.
All we have to say is whether or not understanding of this book depends upon accepting that provisional conclusion.
Yes, obviously.
That the plot of The Room of One's Own means the story is there's a patriarchy. There's a patriarchy for a reason. The patriarchy that exists for a reason has obscured the true position of women and women writers in England. Because I asked you, what's the subject matter of chapter 3 and chapter 4?
But this question that they've obscured them, they haven't existed. And I think that's what happens when she begins to go.
Well, before you tell me, what's the subject? Sorry, what's the subject matter of chapter 3 and what's the subject matter of chapter 4?
Chapter 3 is how a woman Shakespeare would have been treated in Shakespeare's time.
Right.
And
we have Judith Shakespeare.
Yeah. So let's so Judith, and what's the point about Judith Shakespeare?
She would have gone insane.
Okay, let's do a little bit slower. So why is this starting with Judith Shakespeare in this story? What's the significance? I mean, this is half a trick question. What's the significance of Shakespeare?
Because the sister would not get the same recognition that Shakespeare.
Before we get to the sister, what is important about Shakespeare?
He's the pinnacle of literature, English literature.
Thank you. This is the pinnacle of English literature, fiction writing, if we want to be simple about it. And of course, he's a man. And the question is, again, we're back to fiction. If Shakespeare the man had had a sister, according to the book, could she have been a fiction writer?
No.
She didn't have a snowball's chance in hell. Why?
Because she's a woman.
She's a woman.
But why?
No education.
Okay. What
She
else?
wouldn't have been taken seriously by anybody who would need to mentor her.
Yeah, the system would not have allowed her talent to shine.
There were systemic reasons why it was possible for a man to be the greatest flowering of English fiction writing, and the sister of this, presumably, let's assume she had the same DNA, the same genetic code as her brother, same raw material as Bill, and yet the system would have kept Judith from flowering. We come back to this in a second.
Last week about the idea of male privilege, which is a term that was not around when Virginia
Sure.
wrote, but that's what it is.
So we're going to come back to what's the subject matter of chapter 4?
It's a discussion of, she goes through a discussion of women writers.
Well, rather than say discussion, maybe we could do.
Well, she talks about various women writers. So what's the tradition? She's exploring the tradition of women writers now.
So another word instead of tradition, we could, what do you call a book that's talking about the way things were?
History.
This is a history of
Women writers.
when?
I think she's in the 17th and 18th century.
In other words, after
Judith.
After Shakespeare or Judith Shakespeare, who couldn't be a writer.
Right.
I mean, really, whether collectively here, and we can even go into the subject of number 5, whether Mary Seton, Mary Beaton, who didn't find the answers that she was looking for in the British Library, is now reconstructing the history of women writers in England.
Right. It's like what do they call those reenactments? It's like historical fiction.
It might not, you know, the truth is this part might not even be fiction.
Well, some of it's not, for sure.
Well, like there really was a writer named Jane Austen.
Right. And George Eliot.
Yes. I mean, so this is really important. I mean, like we were talking about Bob a few minutes ago, keeping track of which parts of this book are lies and which part are not lies. It may be a lie that the narrator went to the British Library. It may be a lie that there's no such book explicitly titled The Moral, Mental, and Physical Inferiority of Women. It may be a lie that she went to lunch at the restaurant next door and saw a newspaper. But this may actually be a true history of women writers in England. Steve, did you have something?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think this is the whole, in fact, as she shifts particularly into the Jane Austen and the Brontes and George Eliot, she's actually making some pretty insightful comments on true writers. I mean, so I think your point about the fiction in the service of truth, we now have, to some degree, truth in service of fiction.
So can you give us like the short version? What is this book's potted history of the early evolution of women writers of fiction in England following the non-existent Judith Shakespeare? How did it begin? How did it evolve? How did it develop? How did the first woman, I mean, Judith Shakespeare couldn't do it. She had to blow her brains out. How did the daughter of Judith Shakespeare first get a toehold in writing? How did the granddaughter of Judith Shakespeare get a, like, how did it unfold according to the book?
I think they had a benefactor that helped them with a place to write and with time to write, where they didn't have any other duties other than leisure time to write.
So what kinds of women were the earliest women writers?
So you start with the aristocrats.
Why?
They were poets.
Amy?
Well, first she gives us 2 poets, Lady Winchelsea and another countess. But their error, their shortcoming was that they were angry and they were writing from a place of anger. And so then it wasn't until the novelist came on the scene, and particularly Jane Austen. She also mentions the Brontes.
Okay, but hold off on Jane Austen for just a second. Just hold off. Just give us a little bit more, like, really, what's going on with the first generation of women writers and the second generation? And, like, why is it poetry? Why is it aristocrats? Why?
Well, I guess it was aristocrats, and particularly one of them was childless because they had to have the leisure time to be able to write. And supposedly also just, paper and supplies are probably more expensive then. so, but they were angry at the fact that they didn't have the social approval to write. They were angry that I guess that most women were denied the opportunity to write, and so they were held back from their true genius because they were kind of mired in this emotional outburst.
And
So that was the first
why poetry?
Well, I don't think the novel was yet at that time. So we're talking 1600s. I think the novel was very much in its infancy.
But I don't think that's Virginia Woolf's reason, is they just hadn't come up with the novel yet.
Okay, then I don't know.
I mean, so one of the things to be tracing here is who's doing the writing and what kind of writing are they doing? And thirdly, according to Virginia Woolf, how good is the writing? And I think you know, Naomi, you already said like the writing, early women's writing isn't that good.
Right.
And it's being done by upper class women because only upper class women have the space and the time to be able to do this. And that it's not an accident that one of the early women writers is childless.
I think the point she's making is it's amateur in the actual sense of the word. They're not paid professionals and they're just not very good.
Wait, because
but because it's a limited pool of women who are eligible to write these works, the talent is undiscovered that may be out there among women of more modest means.
Isn't she also saying that they just don't have very much experience, or they don't have very much experience with life, and therefore able to write very much?
I thought that it's because that the early writings are not good and our poetry because they're motivated just by sheer emotion and anger and frustration.
And I think this leads, you know, I know we're going through this kind of fast, but if we turn to the granddaughters, as it were, to Jane Austen, and I think our page numbers will diverge, but I'm on page 71 of my book, where there's a section comparing Jane Austen with Shakespeare, and it mentions Antony and Cleopatra.
That's 68 in ours, I think.
Okay. There's a line that begins, this is about Jane Austen, here was a woman about the year 1800. Does everybody see that?
Yeah, it's the fourth line from the top.
Okay. Here was a woman about the year 1800 writing without hate, without bitterness, without fear, without protest, without preaching. That was how Shakespeare wrote, I thought, looking at Antony and Cleopatra. And when people compare Shakespeare and Jane Austen, they may mean that the minds of both had consumed all impediments. And for that reason, we do not know Jane Austen and we do not know Shakespeare. And for that reason, Jane Austen pervades every word that she wrote, and so does Shakespeare. If Jane Austen suffered in any way from her circumstances, it was in the narrowness of life that was imposed upon her. So can we just, Michelle, you just tell us a little bit about this? Like, what is it? What does this mean about writing without hate, without bitterness, et cetera, et cetera?
It means that there's an element of freedom that has been bestowed on the next generation that's been able to allow them to write in a more pure way that's not just reactive in terms of the overwhelming emotion, frustration, and anger that they're feeling, so that there's a legitimacy and a higher quality to the writing and more resonance in the writing for the reader.
Steve?
I think it's that. I think there's also an issue of it's not writing in reaction to, it's writing from within and in control. And also in such a way that the who of the writer can now be ambiguous. It's not a personal letter, it's not a diary, it's not a story of this is what happened to me. It's that, you know, we're still arguing about who Shakespeare is 400 years later. But that doesn't take away from the books. And to some degree, I think she's saying it's the same thing with Jane Austen. You don't need to know about Jane Austen to read those books and understand the author has totally created a fictional world that yet has an enormous amount of truth to it.
But it
Yeah, I
allows
think what
them to write from the point of view of the character and not from their own point of view.
Yeah, it's not so much whether the author is ambiguous, just whether the author disappears
The author disappears.
from the text.
Yes.
Like every time I get you to try to think about Plato, is because Plato has made himself invisible in the text. Well, really, whether Virginia Woolf is claiming that in Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare has made himself invisible. That the reader never thinks about Shakespeare when reading Antony and Cleopatra. The reader never thinks about Jane Austen when reading Pride and Prejudice. As opposed to, apparently, if you read those early women, the angry writers, or even when she's in the library reading Professor Von X, she can never focus on the subject matter of the book because she's always thinking, what is it about this crazy author is so angry? Patrick, you want to put some words around those nods?
No, I'm just agreeing. You basically covered it all. I mean, when you read Shakespeare, you don't think about Shakespeare. You think purely about the characters and the action that are going on. Lady Winchelsea, when you read her poems at the beginning of the chapter, you hear Lady Winchelsea and you're thinking of Lady Winchelsea. She's bitter and she puts it all in the words that in her poems.
It's almost like it's like scream therapy or something, you know? The earlier pieces are almost like a therapeutic exercise of recognize me, I'm here, I exist. It's not about your perception of anything outside of your internal pain.
And that which is low quality fiction writing and which is high quality fiction writing,
Well,
Michelle?
obviously, that's the low quality writing, and the high quality is where it's the ego piece of it is at least hidden from view.
But it's a little bit of a straw man because what she's writing now is clearly speaking. I mean, at times she veers, it's a fictional veneer around what she's writing. This book is as passionate a polemic on the subject as you could imagine.
It's like a position paper.
But the issue is not that you can't have passionate polemics or that Antony and Cleopatra doesn't have a point to make. I think and this goes back to the phrase here that the narrator says that Shakespeare and Jane Austen, the minds of both had consumed all impediments. So Steve, I mean, just as a reading question, what does it mean to say that an author, a would-be author, that person's mind has consumed all impediments prior to writing?
it doesn't mean that the passion has gone away, but it has been successfully submerged in the story and the plot such that you're not, that the surface level of the narrative is not obviously about the underlying issues.
I mean, whether this goes back to page, I think it was, we were on the same page 33 before with Professor Von X, when the narrator is complaining that Professor Von X had written in the red light of emotion rather than the white light of truth. And not that there aren't things to be angry about in the world, but that there's a way in which the anger can consume the anger to the point that it's gone. And now there's a residue of just truth that can be expressed, even if it's making a damning indictment, even if it's a passionate polemic. I mean, in this particular book, I mean, what literally Virginia Woolf has said, here, let's go back to the beginning. On page 5. Here then was I. Call me Mary Beaton, Mary Seaton, Mary Carmichael, or by any other name. It's not a matter of any importance. Who's writing this? Doesn't matter. It's not about me. It's not about my anger. Steve?
Yes and no. And that's the essence of why her writing is so powerful, because she doesn't, or at various times in this case, I mean, she's analyzing Shakespeare and Austen under somewhat different terms than she is writing.
Can you explain that? Can you explain that?
Yes, and what she is writing is a hybrid. As you read through, it's hard not to hear Virginia Woolf's voice coming through, as much as she both tries to hide it and simply uses that as a veil, in some senses, to hide behind, because it lends force to the writing for the purposes that she's writing this book, which is a different kind of book and literature from what she is describing in Shakespeare and Austen.
But look, you've read A Room of One's Own, right? Steve?
Yep.
Does it come across as a book written by an angry lady?
Heck no.
I think that's what we're talking about.
Yep.
Not that it can't be making a passionate point, but that it doesn't come across making you think, my God, what happened to this author?
Correct.
Dick?
Yeah, in fact, she goes to some length to establish that she's somewhat immune from this kind of pressure. She talks about her living, her 10-shilling notes, the fact that she gets 500 a year, and says she's unreachable. She personally is not subject to this kind of problem.
And whether being not susceptible to this kind of problem is one of the essential ingredients of writing high quality fiction. What's the subject matter of chapter 5?
Contemporary writers.
Contemporary what writers?
Virginia Woolf's contemporaries are people that just came before her, living writers of the time. And
you gotta say the magic word.
Women.
Thank you.
oh yes,
Contemporary women writers. All right, and so whether this is now continuing the history of women writers in England from the time of Judith Shakespeare, to the earlier generations of women writers going to Jane Austen, leading to the contemporary generations of women writers. So Michelle, what is the contemporary generation of women writers all about? What's the big novelty in the contemporary women writers?
Well, they're
Go ahead, Amy.
they were writing about, they weren't just novelists or poets, but they were writing about all topics, history, biography. So they have at last kind of achieved some equality with the male writers in that they can write about all the subjects. But then she does turn to one specific female writer, which is Mary Carmichael in the novel about life's adventure.
Well, what's the big innovation in this generation of women writers?
Writing about women from the perspective of women and women interacting with each other rather than just being a foil to men.
In fact, Chloe liked Olivia.
Likes Olivia.
No, really, I mean, and whether this is meant to be fully homoerotic or whatever it is, that somehow we can have women's literature about women that don't have any stinking men in it.
Yes.
And this is considered an advance, I take it, from the book's point of view, Amy. Is that right?
Yeah, and it was actually interesting because when she brought that up, I had to think back to Shakespeare and whether that was true, whether the women were always just, just an ornament to the men.
Yes.
So although Antony and Cleopatra is interesting because, Cleopatra was clearly a leading character, but she was always presented in her relationship to Antony.
Yes, and I think, just like we were saying with Bob earlier, I mean, even if this Virginia Woolf or the book is wrong in its statements, whether the argument of the book is that in the current generation of women writers, one of the key innovations is just getting rid of the men. I mean, just having a female universe for the purpose of a story.
Yes. But it's interesting, though, because she doesn't portray Mary Carmichael as yet an accomplished writer. And so far as I can tell, the only female writer that she held up to us as maybe holding a candle to Shakespeare was Jane Austen. And Jane Austen was writing before all of this and without a room of her own and without her 500 a year. So it's just interesting that that was the only one who achieved that level of I guess, perfection.
And so this takes us to chapter 6, and what the title or the point of chapter 6 is. And I have mine page 109, but we're probably different, where it says, "Here then Mary Beaton ceases to speak." There's like a little break in the text.
Yeah, that's page 105, top of 105 for the standard
105.
book. Yeah.
Everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then, so on the previous, I don't know if it's a page, but the paragraph prior to that, it says, "Even so, the very first sentence that I would write here," I said, crossing over to the writing table and taking up the page headed "Women in Fiction," is that it is fatal for anyone who writes to think of their sex. It is fatal to be a man or woman, pure and simple. One must be woman manly or man womanly. It is fatal for a woman to lay the least stress on any grievance, to plead, even with justice, any cause, in any way to speak consciously as a woman. And fatal is no figure of speech. For anything written with that conscious bias is doomed to death. It ceases to be fertilized. Brilliant and effective, powerful and masterly as it may appear for a day or two, it must wither at nightfall. It cannot grow in the minds of others. Some collaboration has to take place in the mind between the woman and the man before the act of creation can be accomplished. Some marriage of opposites has to be consummated. The whole of the mind must lie wide open if we are to get the sense that the writer is communicating his experience with perfect fullness. There must be freedom and there must be peace. Not a wheel must grate, not a light glimmer. The curtains must be close drawn. The writer, I thought, once his experience is over, must lie back and let his mind celebrate its nuptials in darkness. Let us discuss. Bob? What's this
Yeah,
mean?
I agree with
Forget whether you agree or not. What does it mean?
Well, what she's saying is that for it to be a high quality work of art, the author has to lose his or her identity, his or her sex, so that the work speaks for itself and is highly acceptable by either sex. I think that's what she's saying.
Ned?
I agree. I think she's articulating the idea of a human writer that can embrace all of humanity, male or female.
You mean to be a universal writer?
Yes.
It is to be a great writer. To be a woman writer or a female writer or a male writer is inherently not to be a universal writer. I presume we could do this with race also. To be a black writer or a white writer, or we could do it to religion, to be a Catholic writer or a Jewish writer. To be any kind of writer that is anything less than completely cosmopolitan.
Can I put just a
Amy?
I want to put just a different spin on it because I think she makes the point of saying that it's not to lose your sex. She makes the point somewhere of saying, you know, women should not just lose their femininity. I think she's saying that to take the two sexes and unite them in this fertile creative act is really what it's about. So it's not about being androgynous. It's about taking the feminine and taking the masculine and creating a whole picture, just as the union of man and woman creates, you know, new life, a new child. That's the creative act. So not to lose your sex, but to combine it and make it fertile with the other perspective.
But she said it's exactly androgynous. I mean, she says one must be woman manly or man womanly.
Yes, but in a union, in a consummation, a nuptial act.
To be both.
But not a bland erasure of sex.
I didn't say bland. I just said cosmopolitan.
In the standard text on the top of page 93,
yes,
she's talking about Jane Austen.
Yes.
And she's talking about Jane Austen having mastered the first great lesson. And that is, she wrote as a woman, but as a woman who has forgotten that she is a woman.
Yes. What does that mean?
So I think that's just what Amy was talking about.
Well, what does it mean to say that she's written as a woman who has forgotten that she's a woman?
Well, this comes in the context of there's a when women write, when women write, Virginia Woolf feels that there's a certain style, but it doesn't come with all of the angry baggage that detracts from presenting that nugget of truth.
Steve?
I think it's actually simpler than that in a sense, which is when you're reading Jane Austen, if you didn't know it was by Jane Austen, you probably wouldn't ask, is this being written by a man or a woman? And you certainly wouldn't know.
Or care.
Or care.
Does it matter whether Plato is a guy or not, or whether Shakespeare is a guy or not?
In Shakespeare, no. In Plato, I might argue differently.
Well, okay, but from let's put it this way: from this book's point of view, whether the idea is, and I think, I mean, as long as I just want to be clear about myself, and I know we're rushing through a lot of stuff here, but I'm not trying to say I think that Virginia Woolf is saying that the concerns of women should be forgotten. Not at all. But that the concerns of women can be written about most truthfully and most eloquently when the writer stops being an angry woman. When she's not an angry woman, she's just a great writer. It could have been an angry guy. I mean, it doesn't matter. The sex of the writer becomes immaterial at that point, other than actually having information about the subject matter to be written about. So we just got a few minutes to kind of wrap this up. I know it's been a forced march. So other things, people that we haven't discussed or thoughts on these things. Nick, you got anything you want to share about this room of one's own?
No, I don't.
Stephen?
Well, it's striking how this is at loggerheads with some of the current discussions about cultural appropriation and about the notion that you can only write from things that you've experienced in the culture that you've experienced in it. Yeah. He's taking a very different perspective of what great writing is.
Yes. Others? Nancy, any final thoughts?
One of the things that I think towards the end when she does the call to action, and she says, for my belief, it is that if we live another century or so, I'm talking of the common life, which is the real life, and not of the little separate lives which we live as individuals, and have 500 a year each of us in rooms of our own. If we have the habit of freedom and the courage to write exactly what we think. And she goes on, and I just think that it's just a wonderful summary of everything that she's hoping can happen here. If these women writers if these women begin to understand how important it is to write about their reality, not necessarily as women, but just as people, because then all of us have a better understanding of each other if we have a way to see into these different realities.
All right. Amy, any final thoughts?
It's just that we are now living in that time that she spoke of, 100 years hence. And it makes me wonder, she laid out the argument that there would be a female Shakespeare. And there have been many great writers, and I think Virginia Woolf was one of them. I just wonder if there has yet been a female Shakespeare, or if, I guess time will tell.
Yes. Well, I suppose on that would be a fitting note for us to conclude. So thank you all very much. I hope this was a reasonable room of one's own experience. I guess I'll be seeing you folks again next quarter also, but only for one half of the session. So
which are you teaching?
What's that?
Which section are you teaching?
Bible?
What are we doing? I
Memorial
don't
on
remember. I'd have to look.
The Bible?
Yes, that's it.
Bible.
Yes, okay, good.
The syllabi are already posted.
Yeah, and so enjoy your little holiday. Be safe. Don't get sick. And there's one thing about being online. We don't have to worry about infecting each other. So, that's all good. We'll see you on the flip side. And see, it's good. Ollie's got it. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
Take care.